There's one more coming. I can see her. All right. Okay. Well, all right. Let's go ahead and get started. Okay. All right. Would one of you like to pray for us? All right.
Raise your hand. Lord God, thank you for this day. Thank you for this afternoon that we've hopefully had fun in beginning with the ministries we've been doing with, I know music had stuff and I know Ed's had stuff. I pray that through this next year we all grow in you and we grow in our areas that you have us at. I pray we take stuff away from this teaching we're about to get, and I thank you for Fuzz coming down and being willing to teach us. Jesus, I pray, amen.
All right. Okay. So, I got a question. A little bit of a quiz. So, can somebody tell me maybe what you consider to be the two main points from the first session when we talked about the role of worldview in understanding the relationship between science and faith? Yes, ma'am.
God reveals himself in nature and in Scripture.
Yeah, well, that was the second session, but that was a very good answer. No, that was excellent. Okay, let's build off of that. That's a great summary of the second. So, what does that mean for us in terms of using science to make a case for the Christian faith? What you talked about how God reveals himself to us. So how does that lay the foundation for?
Was the first point you have a loaf of bread and you're trying to explain how to make it, and you can use all the how it got there, but you
Yeah.
can't use anything.
Yes.
Use everything except for the.
Yeah. Yes. That's yeah. So that right. So all right. Good. That's right. You're on target there. So because the whole idea is that when people engage in science according to the way science operates, the rules are that you can only explain the universe and anything else that's part of the universe through some kind of materialistic, mechanistic explanation. You can't appeal to the work of a creator or the work of an agent, right? So when you use the bread baking analogy, or how do you explain the loaf of bread? Well, we can analyze it. We can tell you all the ingredients. We can even tell you maybe how those ingredients underwent transformation when the bread was baked. But you can't say that there was a baker that was responsible for the bread. You can only say that it must have somehow assembled all on its own, that the process in which the ingredients came together to make bread must have somehow happened all on its own. Right? So when you engage in science, and that's the approach that you take, you've made science inherently atheistic in nature, even though it doesn't have to be. That's how you've rendered it, right? And that idea is called methodological naturalism, right? Very good. All right, somebody else. What a key point from? Yeah, I'm sorry. You've told me your name. And Silas.
There's a lot of preconditions about science, and Christianity can actually satisfy them a lot better than even a lot of atheistic ways can.
Yes, that's really important. Why is that? Why would I say that's a real important point?
It shows there's order in the earth, that there's something greater than us that's made us.
Yes, that's true. That's true. But here's kind of the irony of the situation, that if science is birthed out of a Christian worldview, then there's no way that science could ever challenge Christianity, because the whole operation of science is built upon the Christian worldview, right? So there's nothing. In other words, science and Christianity are inherently compatible with each other. They have to be in agreement with each other for that reason, right? Okay, something about the second lecture that you took away.
Like general revelation versus like special revelation.
Mhm.
So, what was like, or special revelation is like, choosing to make himself known to us, like you were saying. Versus general revelation is like our conscience and our actual, our existence itself.
Yeah, as human beings, because we bear God's image. But nature itself is also a way that God reveals himself. So you can think of nature as God's spoken word based on Psalm 33, and then Scripture is God's written word, and of course Jesus is the word in the flesh, right? So God has made himself known to us. So how would you respond to somebody who says, I can't believe in God because if God existed, he would make himself known to us? He does, yeah. All right, so those two sessions were really laying the foundation for now what we're going to do from here on out, which is going to be we're going to have a lot of fun. Not that we haven't had fun up to this point, but we're going to have a lot of fun because what we've done is we've said, look, the worldview that emerges out of Christianity is responsible for science, right? And we've said God has made himself known through nature, through what he's made, and therefore, if science is the study of nature, we would expect that as we study nature, we should see evidence for God's fingerprints, we should see evidence for God's character, and we would expect that the creation accounts in Scripture should be reliable too. That if they're speaking about God's work as creator, they should harmonize with what we know to be true about nature, right? So that's laying the foundation. So now we're going to talk about the use of science to defend the Christian faith and really to go one step further and build a bridge to the gospel. So does anybody know what apologetics is? Somebody want to venture a definition of apologetics?
Defending your faith.
Okay, defending your faith. Good. That's a really good. Anybody else want to add to that? Or okay, so yeah, did you want to say? Okay, so there's a very important passage in the New Testament in one of the letters that Peter wrote to the church in Asia Minor, 1 Peter 3:15 and 16, which says, "Always be ready to give the reasons for the hope that you have, and do it with gentleness, respect, and a clear conscience." And so what Peter is saying to the church in Asia Minor, which was undergoing persecution, that you should live your life in such a way that people are going to ask you, what is the reason for the hope that you have? And that you should be prepared to give those reasons. Isaac, did you want to make? 1 Peter 3:15 and 16. There's other passages that people use to justify apologetics, but that's the kind of the linchpin passage. And in the original Greek, the word that is used to give reasons for the hope you have is apologia, which means to give a legal defense. So it's if you were in court and you were going to defend yourself, the word that you would use is apologia. So that's where the idea of defending your faith comes from. But apologetics is very much a theological activity. It's part of Christian theology. And so there are different types of apologetic efforts that people engage in. One you might call is theological apologetics. And what that usually involves is explaining what Christianity is about. Right? So if you engage somebody who is a Muslim, in my experience, most Muslims have a distorted view of Christianity. So one of the things you can do is understand Christian theology well enough that you can actually explain it to somebody else who has no concept or who has a misunderstanding of Christianity. Or if you're engaging Jehovah's Witnesses or people that are part of the Church of the Latter-day Saints, Mormons, you want to be able to explain Christianity and correct the misunderstandings that people have. Another area of apologetics we might call philosophical apologetics, where you're using philosophy to defend the Christian faith. And a lot of times that involves philosophical arguments for God's existence or philosophical defenses of key Christian doctrines like the Trinity or the idea that Jesus is fully God and fully human. There's also historical apologetics where you show that the Scripture is reliable, right, through archaeological work or through historical records, right? A lot of that also includes showing that the Scriptures we have actually trace back to the earliest manuscripts, that there's not been a distortion in the Scriptures that we have. And then there's cultural apologetics where you engage ideas in our culture. And then what we're going to talk about is scientific apologetics, where we use science as a way to defend our faith and to build a bridge to the gospel. So those are different areas, and they're not mutually exclusive. What we're going to discover is a lot of what we talk about is going to actually overlap with philosophical apologetics and with cultural apologetics as well. Okay, so nothing is in isolation, but that gives you a big picture view of the landscape of apologetics. And so I would encourage everyone who's a Christian, whether is to develop some specialization in one area of apologetics, right? You don't have to be an expert in every area, but you should develop expertise, at least a working understanding of one area of apologetics. And just go to where you naturally gravitate towards where your gifting or your interest is. But if you're able to have a good working knowledge of certain areas of apologetics, you're going to be very effective at sharing your faith. And God will bring people to you that have certain questions and certain objections. Okay, here's some statistics that I think are helpful for us. A few years ago, Lifeway Research did a survey that said, in the last 6 months, how many people who've attended church shared their faith, right? And how many people invited someone to church? And what they discovered is that 78% of people that attended church in the last 6 months did not share their faith once. And 59% did not even invite one person to church. So this is a problem because it means that as a church we're not evangelizing people. We're not sharing our faith. We're not inviting people to church. And one reason you could venture that might explain that is I think a lot of people are afraid that if they share their faith or invite someone to church, they might start asking them questions that they are not going to be able to answer. And so this is why it's important for you to spend a little bit of time becoming good, at least in one area of apologetics. Now, when it comes to scientific apologetics, a survey done by Lifeway Research showed that of all Americans, 72% said that they believe that the organization of the universe points to a creator. And 46% of people that are non-religious. Now, it doesn't mean they're atheists. It means they just don't identify with any particular religion. So in other words, the whole idea of scientific apologetics is to show how the organization of the universe points to the reality of a creator. And people are actually primed to respond to that evidence, according to this survey at least. And so Ed Stetzer, who is now the dean at Talbot, he was the president of Lifeway, or executive director, I'm sorry, said, it appears people, even non-religious people, are indeed open to apologetics arguments if Christians will actually make them. So again, that's the plea from me to you. So in a scientific apologetics, there are 3 goals that we're working to do. One is to establish God's existence. And it's not just enough to say God exists, because a lot of times people will say, as an objection, well, you say that there's evidence for God's existence, but which God is it? Right? Could it be the flying spaghetti monster, right? So people that worship that's kind of a made up God that was meant to poke at Christians who use science to defend the faith. And people that worship the flying spaghetti monster are called Pastafarians, by the way. That was a joke. Obviously not much of a joke, but that was a joke. But it's not enough just to say it's a creator. We've got to do some work to show who that creator is. And you can actually use science to say that the most likely candidate for that creator is the God that's described in the Bible. And then we want to show that the creation accounts are reliable. Now, the Bible is not a science textbook, right? It's a book about our relationship to God and how we can be redeemed through the work of Christ on the cross. That's what the Bible is about. But God the Redeemer is God the Creator. And so many times to communicate that we can actually trust in God's message of redemption, we're reminded that that God who is redeeming us is the God who made everything, right? And so this idea of God the Creator is critical to the plan of redemption in that respect. But there are statements about what God has done as Creator. And those statements, even though they were written in the ancient Near Eastern context, right, or written in really in first century Rome, in a pre-scientific age, if they indeed are revelations coming to us from God, even though they are written in a particular context that's pre-scientific, the concepts that are communicated should indeed be valid based on what we're learning about the world through science, okay? Now, when it comes to making a case for God's existence, this is where philosophy and the scientific apologetics interact, right? And so to understand how you can use science to make arguments for God's existence, you have to first recognize that the arguments you're making are fundamentally philosophical. I hear people tell me all the time, I don't know anything about science, I can't make these arguments. Yes, you can, because the arguments are not scientific, they're philosophical, right, at the end of the day. And if you pick up a textbook on the philosophy of religion, there will be a chapter on the arguments for God's existence. And these are the classical arguments that are presented, usually in a philosophy textbook. The cosmological argument, the teleological argument, and the ontological argument. Right? And I'll explain which each one is. The cosmological argument could be understood as an argument from beginning, right? And it goes something like this. If something begins to exist, it must have a cause. That cause must be greater than it. And we can make an argument that the universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe must have a cause that's greater than that, and that cause is God. That's one version of the cosmological argument that's the easiest to understand and the most relevant to what we're doing. There's other versions of it that are a little bit more complicated, but that's one of the versions. Now, historically, philosophers tried to show that you can make a philosophical argument for the necessity of the universe's beginning, but we now can show that the universe had a beginning from science. And if the universe has a beginning, there must be a beginner. There must be a first cause. That's what that argument involves. Yes?
If you believe that, though, wouldn't they just come back and say, well, who created God then?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
So and we can address that because even if you, that objection is irrelevant. And here's the reason why. Because the universe has a beginning, period. Something must have caused it. And that cause is either a personality, like a god, a creator, or it's some kind of impersonal force. So let's say people appeal to the multiverse, right? Well, then the problem is, well, what causes the multiverse? Well, according to Stephen Hawking and Lawrence Krauss, it was an eternally existing gravitational field that fluctuated. Okay, so what causes that, right? So you keep going back in this infinite regress of causes. So at some point, as a scientist, you have to stop and say, there's got to be an uncaused cause, something that eternally exists that causes the universe. Whether it's a gravitational field or God, those are your two choices. But everybody's got to embrace an uncaused cause. You can't get away from that. And so, and by the way, to appeal to a multiverse or eternally existing gravitational field, there's no way you can show those exist scientifically. Because we can't show the existence of anything outside of this universe. We don't have the scientific wherewithal to do that. So those ideas are, though they are couched in scientific terms and there are all these mathematical equations flying around, these are basically theological statements. The multiverse is theological. This eternally existing gravitational field is theological or philosophical. It's not scientific. So don't let the scientific language or the math confuse you. It's philosophical. It's no more a scientific statement than to say there's a creator that brought everything into existence. Right? Great question. Anybody else? Okay, so that's the cosmological argument, and we'll unpack that, okay? We'll unpack that a little bit more. The teleological argument, that word just simply means design and purpose. And so it's an argument where you note design and purpose, and from that design and purpose, you conclude there must be a designer. If there's design, if there's purpose, there's got to be a personality that is responsible for the design and purpose. And that personality would be God. Okay? And then the last one is the ontological argument. That is an argument from being. And we're not going to talk about that. That doesn't have any bearing on what we're doing. To me, it's a very complicated argument that I don't understand. And either it's really not a great argument, because it doesn't feel like a great argument to me, or there's something incredibly profound that I can't grasp with the ontological argument. Anyway, you can, on your spare time, look it up and have fun with that if you want. There's some people that think that's the greatest argument that there could possibly be. Yeah, for God's existence, yes. Oh, okay. Okay, so the cosmological argument. And we could spend hours and hours and hours talking about why astronomers think that the universe had a beginning. But bottom line, for your purposes, it's sufficient to say the universe had a beginning. This is what science is telling us. That matter, energy, space, and time, these are the fundamental, this is the fundamental fabric of the universe. These are the fundamental quantities that define the universe. Matter, energy, space, and time all had a beginning, and that beginning coincided. Right? This is called a singularity. Right? And so from that singularity, the entire universe unfolds. This is well established. Almost every astronomer that I'm aware of believes that we live in what's called a Big Bang universe. And the Big Bang just simply is a term used to state that the universe had a beginning and that the universe is expanding from that point of beginning. A well-established fact. So, because this is well established scientifically, that first premise, or that premise that the universe began to exist, is now supported by science. If something begins to exist, it must have a cause that's greater than it. The universe began to exist, it must have a cause that's greater than that. That's as simple as that. That's something that every Christian ought to be able to articulate. You don't need to know all the astronomy. It's great if you do. You don't need to know all the astronomy, because that idea is pretty much unequivocal. All right, so the design argument, this actually takes on a number of different forms. And one of the projects I've been doing for 25 years is looking at the design argument, in biology, and specifically in biochemistry. And I've developed a number of different versions of that design argument over the years. This is, again, an argument that we can make cosmologically. We can make it with respect to the Earth and with respect to biological systems. So there's three elements to the design argument. One of them is dealing with cosmology. It turns out that, that when physicists study the universe, they have discovered that there are these fundamental particles and fundamental forces, and that you can use mathematical equations to describe the particles and describe the forces, and those equations have constants in them. These are values that don't change, right? And it turns out that those constants have to assume precise exacting values if the universe is going to be able to support life. And that if even one of a long list of these constants or parameters or characteristics varies ever so slightly, that the universe cannot support life at all. They all have to assume these precise exacting values. Sometimes this is called the fine-tuning of the universe, or the fine-tuning of the constants of the universe. And that fine-tuning suggests design. It also suggests purpose, because that fine-tuning is necessary for life to exist. So there's a purpose, or a fitness to purpose, for the universe because of that fine-tuning. So one example would be that something called the cosmological constant, we don't need to be concerned about what that is, has to be fine-tuned on the order of 1 part in 10 to the 40th power, right? 1 part in 10 to the 40th power. Or sorry, 1 part in 10 to the 120th power. I made a mistake. It's 1 part in 10 to the 120th power. Now, what does that mean, right? What does that mean? Well, in practical terms, let's say that I borrowed from Ben, let's say I borrowed $1,000, and he wants me to pay him back. So I'm going to give him $999 because that's all I have on me. And I said, Ben, here's $999. So I shorted Ben $1, right? That $1 is 1 part in 10 to the 3rd power. Okay, now let's say, and you know, and Ben, he might want that dollar, right? Because $1 out of 1,000, it's not like, it's insignificant, but it's still $1, right? Now let's say I borrow $1 million from Ben. You want to make friends with Ben because this guy's loaded with money. And let's say I borrow $1 million and I give him $999,999 back. Would Ben care that I didn't give him the full $1 million? Well, that $1 is 1 part in 10 to the 6th. So if I borrow $1 billion and I short Ben $1, that's 1 part in 10 to the 9th power. We're talking 1 part in 10 to the 120th power. That is how extreme the fine-tuning is with respect to the cosmological constant. And it's not just that, but it's a whole litany of constants that have to assume these precise exacting values.
Examples of what that means, like, what does that mean in the planets, if they have to be a certain way?
Well, we'll get to that. Okay, we'll get to that. But yeah, so, because right now we're talking about the constants of physics. So there's another expression of the design argument, which you're thinking of, Rick, which is with respect to Earth. And that's, yeah. So speaking of that, there's another version of the design argument. This one is with respect to the Earth itself. It used to be thought not that long ago that the Earth was just like this average planet orbiting an average star, part of an average galaxy, that there was billions and billions and billions of life support planets out there. And we now know that this isn't the case. In fact, that idea is being replaced by something called the rare earth hypothesis, which basically says, look, the Earth is unique with respect to its capabilities of supporting life, or it's virtually unique. So we have to be orbiting a just right star that's part of a just right solar system, that is part of a just right galaxy. We have to be in the just right location in the galaxy. That galaxy's got to be part of a just right cluster of galaxies. Our planet itself has to have a long list of just right properties that actually are just right over time in order for life to be possible. So all of these just right things lining up is extremely improbable. And what Rick is pointing out is that you can do calculations looking at what is the probability of all of these features lining up just right, and the probability is so small that there's not enough estimated planets in our solar system that could actually such that even one of them would have life on it. It looks like the Earth is basically a miracle. Okay, I saw a couple of hands. You first.
So basically, like, if like those who don't believe that all this design was fine-tuned by a designer just believe in coincidence after coincidence after coincidence, because like all these are established.
Yeah.
Like, we know that the chance of life is like an insane number.
Yeah.
So then they just believe in coincidence.
That's pretty much it. Yeah. Yeah. Or or you can fudge the numbers when you do the calculations. But yeah, it's pretty much accepted that the Earth is highly unusual. So even people that wouldn't say, okay, it looks like the Earth is a miracle, they still would argue that the Earth seems to be really unusual in its capacity to support life, and that the likelihood of life elsewhere is really pretty remote. Right. Isaac, you had a question.
It's not really much of a question, but I thought it was really interesting. I wanted to share. I saw a video of a scientist who read the Bible. He sat down every night and he decided to run the numbers for
Yeah.
the probability of all of these specific things falling in place, like
Yep.
exactly without a creator.
Right.
And you gave us the example that like kind of shows us a little bit of the perspective. A billion is 1 part to the 10 to the 9th.
Right.
Right? The sudden reversal of the law of thermodynamics, I think that's what it's called.
Yeah.
If that happens, you basically just die. And that's like 1 part to 10 to the 120th.
Yeah.
Or 300th or something. But the probability that the universe came together like this, just right, without a creator, is like 1 to 10 to the 400th.
Right.
Or something completely
Yep.
ridiculous.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, those are the kind of numbers that people throw around, right? Yeah. And you probably saw a video by Hugh Ross. Would be my suspicion. But yeah. So So the point is that the probabilities are so remote that the likelihood of a planet having all those probabilities by chance is just simply not possible in the universe when you estimate the number of planets in the known universe. And the only way around it is to argue that the visible universe is much smaller than the actual size of the universe, right? And if that's the case, that it diminishes the strength of the argument. But even then, people that would take that view are still saying, look, the Earth appears to be really highly unusual. And so this is a type of design argument where you're saying the Earth is just right. Okay. We're going to revisit these arguments in more detail probably tomorrow, I think. So this is just kind of an introduction. What I'm trying to do is just give you a big picture landscape. Okay, and really what I'm hoping to do is give you kind of a big picture perspective, give you kind of the lay of the land, and then if you're interested, you can dig into the details to a greater degree. Okay, so there's also an argument that can be made from biology for design as well. And if you look at the classical argument for design in the life sciences, it's the watchmaker argument. And this was an argument advanced by William Paley in the late 1700s in a book called Natural Theology. And Paley tells a story to set up the argument where he said, suppose I'm walking along and my foot hits a stone and I pick up the stone and examine it. I would say, well, that rock has been here forever, as far as I know, right? Then he continues his walk, and his foot hits an object, and he picks it up, and it's a watch. And he said, well, how did that watch get there? Right? And he said, well, that explanation for the watch is different from the rock. The rock could be explained through natural processes, but the watch requires a watchmaker to explain it. And so he says, well, what is the difference between the two? Well, a watch is made up of these parts that interact precisely to fulfill the purpose of the watch, which is to tell time. And that if even one of those parts was poorly fabricated or was missing, that watch would not be able to function. And so Paley surveys what was known about biological systems at that time and concludes that that biology has more in common with a watch than it does with a rock, and therefore, if a watch requires a watchmaker, life must require a creator. In other words, what Paley is getting at is things that are made by designers have certain characteristics that reflect the work of a designer. That's essentially Paley's argument. And so as a watch requires a watchmaker, life requires a creator, is the way the argument goes. And so this is what Paley writes. He said, if the different parts had been differently shaped from what they are, or placed after any other manner or in any other order than that in which they are placed, either no motion at all would have been carried on in the machine, or none which would have answered to the use that is now served by it. This mechanism being observed, the inference we think is inevitable, that the watch must have had a maker. There must have existed at some time and at some place or other an artificer or artificers who formed it for the purpose which we find it actually to answer, who comprehended its construction and designed its use. Right? So that's the whole premise of the watchmaker argument. And something that to me is remarkable is that I'm a biochemist, and what we've learned as biochemists about the nature of biochemical systems is that they really look like they are designed, that they have the defining properties of designed systems. That is the hallmark characteristics of biochemical systems. And these are just some examples of those qualities. And so if we say these qualities are evidence for the work of a human designer, when we see an object or a system or a device made by a human designer and we see them in the cell, this should be evidence that there must be a designer that brought life into existence. In addition to that, there are a number of other systems that in their totality look to be like the very systems that we would make as human designers. And again, we could spend hours and hours and hours going through this. I'm just going to give you one example, and if you want to dig deeper, you can on your own. But these are molecular machines. And a molecular machine is a protein complex inside the cell that operates like a motor, right? Its architecture and its operation is identical to a motor. And this one is called ATP synthase. That is one of the most important protein complexes in nature. It's found virtually in every cell in nature, and it's critical in generating the energy that the cell needs to operate. So these are actual scientific depictions of what these proteins look like. But just to give you some context for what we're looking at, here's a cutaway of an animal cell, right? And you can see like the nucleus and the nucleolus inside the nucleus, and there's the endoplasmic reticulum, the network of membranes, and you've got, the Golgi apparatus and these little bean-shaped structures called mitochondria. So I've blown up one of the mitochondria. It's about the size of a bacterial cell, and very similar in its architecture to a bacterial cell. And then you can see a really thin envelope that surrounds the cell. That's the cell membrane. So the ATP synthase is found inside the membranes of mitochondria. They're embedded in the mitochondrial membranes. So And when we blow up a membrane, and this is just a cutaway of a portion of it, it looks something like this. This is a cartoon, but it looks something like this, where you have these two layers that are sandwiched together, and then embedded in those layers are these larger structures, the pink structures and the little green wiggly things. Those are proteins that are embedded in the membrane. And so ATPase is a protein. It's a protein that's embedded in the membrane. And proteins themselves are complex molecules. They're made up of amino acids that are linked together into chains, and those chains fold, and then those folded chains interact with other folded chains to form a complex, right? And so ATP synthase is made up of hundreds of individual protein chains that are folded together that form this very interesting architecture. It looks like a pie with a mushroom growing out of it, right? That's what it looks like. Well, the pie is actually something called the motor protein. It's the motor. It's made up of what are called motor proteins, and it's essentially an electrically powered engine where the flow of protons are positively charged. The flow of charge is called electrical current. Electrical current going through that pie-like structure causes a rotor to rotate, and as that rotor rotates, there's a cam at a right angle that bumps into those green and blue things, causing them to move. These are essentially turbines, and this is all held together by a stator. These are machine parts. These are the parts of a rotary motor, right? This is an electrically powered rotary motor that operates at virtually 100% efficiency. And this is a video produced by biochemists showing the action of the protein when it goes through what's called a catalytic cycle to generate molecules of ATP, which are the fuel source in the cell. So when you watch this, just look at how much it looks like a machine when it's in operation.
These protons drive a rotation of the turbine within ATP synthase, resulting in the synthesis of ATP. Like all generators, ATP synthase consists of two separate motors coupled together. Within the membrane, we have the FO motor, named after the binding of antilogic oligomycin. And at the top, we have the F1 motor from factor 1.
So that's the operation. That's a single protein that, again, is a molecular motor, right? And so we know from experience, right, that if there's a motor, right, motors require designers to design them, to fabricate them. And this is just one of hundreds of examples that I could talk about of molecular motors that bear this real eerie resemblance to man-made machines. But this is what Nick Lane says. He's a biochemist, an atheist at the University College of London. He wrote a book called The Vital Question, which is about the origin of life. And this is what he says about ATP synthase. The most impressive nanomachine of them all, ATP synthase, is indeed a rotary motor in which the flow of protons turns a crankshaft, which in turn rotates a catalytic head. That protein works like a hydroelectric turbine. This is barely poetic license, but a precise description, yet it is hard to convey the astonishing complexity of this protein motor. This is precision nanoengineering of the highest order, a magical device, and the more we learn about it, the more marvelous it becomes. Some see it as proof for the existence of God. I don't, but it is undoubtedly a wondrous machine, right? So again, even an atheist is marveling at the design of this machine. And so this is, again, an argument that we can make for design using the insights from biochemistry, right? So what we've done is we've said, look, you can use the cosmological argument and what we've learned from astronomy to determine, the universe has a beginning, to argue that there must be a beginning to the universe. We can use the design of the constants of physics. We can use the design of the Earth. We can use the design of biology to make a case for a creator. So these are, in a sense, four separate arguments for God's existence that we can employ. But collectively, we've got this weight of evidence that says it really looks like the universe and that life is the product of a designer. Now, another goal of scientific apologetics is to establish God's identity, right? To establish God's identity. And so again, it's not just enough to say there is a creator. We want to know who that creator is. And science can help us do that. As we mentioned, well, God must be transcendent, right? That's what the cosmological argument tells us, that the creator must be independent of the universe, must be greater than the universe itself in order to bring the universe into existence. So that creator must be transcendent. That's how we understand God, is he's a transcendent creator. He must be personal. Why would I say that? Because design and purpose, which we see in the universe, which we see in the structure of the earth, which we see in the design of biological systems, that design and purpose can only come from a personality. Design and purpose are something that a personality, so it's a personal transcendent cause. That right away eliminates everything but Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. Those are your three options. It must be a singular creator. Now, why would I say that? Because when you look at biological systems, there is a universality to them, right? That every organism on the planet has the same biochemistry, right? Every organism uses DNA and proteins and has cell membranes that are made up of the same stuff, right? Every organism is made up of one or two different cell types, prokaryotic cells or eukaryotic cells. There's a universality to biology, and that suggests that there must be a singular God, right? It's not going to be a collection of gods that are each individually creating, because if that was the case, then things would look chaotic in nature, that we wouldn't expect the same designs over and over and over again. God is unchanging, right? The laws of physics are constant, right? That was one of the requirements in order to do science, is that there's a constancy to the laws of nature, right? And we see in Jeremiah 33 this idea that God is constant, he's unchanging. We also see that in Hebrews, right? The book of Hebrews, where God is Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever, that God is unchanging. This actually eliminates Islam as the possibility that Allah cannot be the creator. Why would I say that? Because in Islamic theology, Allah is capricious. He changes his mind all the time. He's not trustworthy in that sense, right? And so you've got a problem with Allah's capricious nature and the fact that the universe seems to indicate that creator is unchanging, right? And then finally, when you look at the beauty of the world, we talked about this a little bit this morning. When we look at the beauty of the world, that beauty suggests that this God is a God who is an artist. And we could go on and on and on and on. But what we're seeing here is a picture that we can create of who that creator must be based on what we can infer about the creator from what we've learned, through science, and it looks very much like the God of the Bible. Okay, and then the next thing we want to do is establish the credibility of the creation accounts. Now, what I'm going to do today, is just focus on Genesis 1. We'll pick this up and look at other creation passages in a couple of days, but I'm going to focus on Genesis 1 now, because when we think about the scientific credibility of the creation accounts, everybody's attention is immediately focused on Genesis 1. So that's what we'll do, but that's not the only creation account in Scripture or creation passage. And it's remarkable that Genesis 1 displays scientific accuracy. This is actually something that I even recognized before I was a Christian. I was in college, I was an agnostic. I had a friend who's named David Flynn, and his father was a Methodist minister. And he and I would get into these conversations about all kinds of strange things, like was Jesus haploid or diploid? And I can explain to you what's going on there if you're interested. But one of the conversations we had was about Genesis 1. And I can remember David and I wrestling around with this, and we ended up concluding that if you understood day as a period of time, that the sequence of events that you see in Genesis 1 is remarkable compared to the history of the earth and the history of life on earth. So that was a conclusion that we came up with. And that was something that I tucked away so that later on, when I did become a Christian, it was something I immediately drew on in terms of how does Genesis 1 fit in all of this. But here's an interesting quote I'm going to read from a guy named Andrew Parker. Andrew Parker, as far as I know, is not a believer. And he is a paleontologist and studies the Cambrian explosion. And we'll talk about that in a couple of days. But Andrew Parker wrote a book called In the Blink of an Eye, where he proposed a theory for how he thought the Cambrian explosion could have been driven by evolutionary processes. And in response to the book, a number of people wrote him letters saying, could the Cambrian explosion be referenced on the fifth day of creation in Genesis 1? He became curious and he started studying Genesis 1. And after spending significant time studying it, he wrote a book called The Genesis Enigma. And this is what he said. It remains extraordinary that against all odds, the writer of the creation account of Genesis 1 got it right, and that the skeleton of his exposition was scientifically accurate. The image in the writer's mind of how our planet and life came together to be must have seemed so far off contemporary knowledge and experience that he was unable to dress it in human clothes and could only present it unaltered as if it had been dictated to him. Yet the words he wrote later emerged as an exact match with modern science. If my inference is right, then the writer of Genesis 1, or rather the announcer of the story, Moses, surely must have received divine intervention. That is to say, he must have been spoken to by God. This is a non-believer that wrote these words, which is remarkable that this has not had an effect on him, but these are the words of a non-believer. Yes?
So you're studying Genesis as a non-believer?
Yes. With the idea, does this correlate with what we see in the scientific record? That was his interest, because that's what people were asking him. So we'll get into some more details about Genesis 1 in a couple of days. But the point that I'm making is that for me as a non-believer, for Andrew Parker as a non-believer, what led us to conclude that there's a remarkable harmony between Genesis 1 and the scientific record was seeing day as a period of time, right? Seeing day as a period of time. And that view is called the day-age view. And we'll talk more about that tomorrow. But probably for many of you, you've always understood day as being 24 hours, or the Genesis 1 creation account as being 6 24-hour days that are sequenced together, that creation took place in a week. And I actually think that is not the best reading of Genesis 1. I think Genesis 1 is actually telling us that creation took place over the span of 6 epochs, 6 vast periods of time. And when we understand it that way, there's this amazing agreement that emerges out of that. And so the question is it legitimate to see day as a period of time? Is that legitimate? Well, the word that's translated as day in Hebrew is yom, right? And it can mean pretty much the way we would use the word day. It can mean part of a day. It can mean the time from sunup to sundown. It can mean 24 hours, or it can mean a period of time. So why would we say yom should be a period of time? Well, Walt Kaiser, the well-known Hebrew scholar who's in his 90s now, argued that the first 24-hour period of time, the first calendar day or ordinary day, was actually created within the first creation day. Therefore, a creation day must be greater than simply 24 hours, right? That's his argument, which I find to be a compelling argument. Gleason Archer, another Hebrew scholar, argued that if you're going to have harmony between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, a day must be a period of time, right? Because in the sixth day of creation in Genesis 1, male and female are created as the last of God's creative work, right? Male and female are created in God's image. Genesis 2 is an expansion of the sixth day of creation. Now, there's some people that say, well, Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 are separate creation accounts. Others actually say that they are sequential accounts. They're not the same account. I actually think they are the same account, where Genesis 2 is just expanding on Genesis 1. And the reason why I would say that is if you look at Mark 10:6, when Jesus is speaking about the institution of marriage, he is taking both Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 and putting them together when he says that marriage was instituted at the point of creation in the beginning. In the beginning, the marriage was a gift given to us by God, an institution created by God. So Jesus saw Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 as complementary. But if you're going to take that view, then you have to see day as a period of time. Why would I say that? Because again, on the sixth day, male and female are created. In Genesis 2, Adam is made from the dust of the earth, and God breathes the breath of life into him. Adam is not created in the Garden of Eden, by the way. He's created before the Garden of Eden grows. Then God plants a garden and causes it to grow. And in the original Hebrew, it's growing through natural means. Adam is placed in the garden, and he works and he cares for the garden. That implies a period of time. Adam names the animals. And naming animals is not just simply throwing out names helter-skelter. What he was doing was he was studying the animals, right? Because to give something a name in Hebrew meant that you understood that character of that individual, and the name reflected the character, right? Abram's name was changed to Abraham after God called him, right? His wife Sarai's name was changed to Sarah after she gave birth to Isaac. So the idea here is that names were meaningful. They reflected the character of that individual, right? So Adam has to study these animals, right, to name them. And also naming meant that he had dominion over them. To name something meant you had authority over it. So that's a very important theological point that's being communicated there. But it's through that process of studying them that he realizes that none of them are suitable for him, right? And then God creates Eve to be his helpmate. There's also direct statements about the earth's antiquity in Scripture, right? So, for example, 2 Peter 3:5 speaks about the heavens and the earth existing long ago. Proverbs 8:22 and 23, that the world existed long ago, right? That Psalm 68:33 says the skies are ancient. Genesis 49:26, the mountains and the hills are age old. Deuteronomy 33:15, the mountains and the hills are ancient, right? Habakkuk 3:6 says the same thing. Judges 5:21, the rivers are ancient, right? Or at least this particular river, Kishon, is ancient, right? In Job, it also says humanity is ancient. So the point here is that these are statements that make sense if indeed we understand the earth to be ancient or the earth to be old. And there's more reasons I could go through. But the bottom line is that what we see here is that if we understand day as a period of time, and there are very good biblical reasons to think that day is a period of time, we actually see this remarkable harmony between Genesis 1 and the scientific record. Now, tomorrow, we're going to talk about different perspectives on creation, right? Different approaches that people have taken to creation. We're going to talk about a theological objection that people raise regarding day as a period of time. Then we're going to resume talking about the scientific credibility of the creation accounts in Scripture. So that's kind of the roadmap for where we're going. So are there any questions or any comments that you'd like to make? I know that it's probably past, we're right at 5. Isaac.
Are we going to go over like, what if we're all made by robots argument? I'm just so curious.
What if we're made by robots?
Something like that, I don't know. Like, what's the thing, like in the Matrix? Or like the robot?
Oh,
All right, buddy.
oh, is the universe a simulation?
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, I mean, I didn't plan on covering that, but we can talk about that. I mean, there actually are some physicists who are speculating along those lines that maybe the universe is actually a simulation. But if the universe is indeed a simulation, yeah, I mean, it doesn't really. The theological implications are pretty remarkable. But the common sense experience that we all have is that the universe is real, right?
Do you know if it's true? I've heard before that the Earth is in the perfect spot and we have the best view of the galaxy.
Yes.
Like if the Earth was in any other spot, there'd be like stars that were too close
Yep.
and we wouldn't be able to see other stars.
Yep. So not only is the Earth perfectly designed for life to exist on the Earth and human civilization, but the same qualities that make it exactly right for habitability also make it just right for the ability to observe the universe. That if we're any other place, we wouldn't be able to see. So that double coincidence is really eerie in some respects, and it's saying that God wants us to discover the universe, right, and through that process discover Him. And that makes sense in light of the idea that we talked about this morning, that God has revealed Himself to us through nature, right? If He's revealed Himself through nature, then nature should be accessible to us. I mean, there's another version of that argument that applies to biology, and that's related to this idea that there's universality to biochemistry, universality to the design of cells, right? Even if you look at how animals develop embryologically, there's identical pathways that animals take. Well, that actually makes biology possible as a scientific discipline, right? Biology is only possible because of that universality that we see in living systems. Otherwise, biology wouldn't be possible. So that's another version of that idea of a privileged planet, right, where we're perfectly placed to discover the universe. Life is also designed in such a way that we can actually understand living systems. Great question. Anybody else? Okay. See you tomorrow.